Good evening. If I may borrow the words of Dr. Noruddin, you said, those remaining are the non-zombies. The zombies have left the place, but I'm sure staying here one whole day will be a difficult target for most of us here. I have on my right Prof. Alan from the NUS and Rashid from the Nathan Associates. On my left, Dr. Poncio, and on my further left, Nora Shikin from Brunei. We have come to the last session. If you will just allow me to run through the whole program that we have had this morning. We started off with two excellent speeches this morning. One is, of course, by my boss, Dr. Lim, and then followed by Pa Iman. But I use the word excellent speeches because it gave the audience the right start to the symposium itself, AEC 2015, where Dr. Lim had presented a candid picture of where we are now, and he did not hold back in terms of the challenges that the ASEAN Economic Community building process is undergoing. And then the most important part is he requested the private sector who is here today to share their views so that we can move towards the AEC building process. Just to quote Pa Iman and to answer a number of ideas or number of burning questions in the audience, AEC 2015, he concluded as follows: let us not declare we lost the war when the battle is still on. So have faith in us, in other words, he's saying. Have faith in us. Don't ask us about 2015 now, because we are still building that common platform to achieve AEC 2015. That was his message, in short. The second session on the open skies saw these views from the private sector. Number one, mindset change in ASEAN. Think ASEAN, not national. Number two, government facilitate and keep operational costs low for the businesses to do their work. If government puts in impediments in what they want to do, the private sector will find a way around it, meaning additional costs to them. And on integration, this is what they meant, a frank view. In fact, the person apologized for giving this frank view from the private sector. He said, the private sector is integrating on their own, with or without the AEC initiatives. So that was the main picture that I gathered from, or main points that I think was important for this particular symposium, where we are trying to bring the private sector and hear their views, frank views on this. On sessions 3 on ASEAN Single Window, I had the benefit of moderating the ending session. We had an ASEAN Single Window Symposium, the first regional symposium where we brought the private sector and the regulators together. Believe me or not, at the end of the day, the conclusion was still the same. They had the same things that were impeding they thought, the question that was put forward to both the groups, the trade regulators and the business sector who is looking for trade facilitation, what would be the end state in ASEAN Single Window? And both of them, believe me, Rashid will give you the list, came with the same views. And in the following session, we had the ASEAN investment area. The messages from that particular session, again, we get the same call from the private sector, or even if not the private sector, the presenter, think ASEAN, not national. Make ASEAN more sexy, he said, than what it is today, in order for ASEAN to be a more attractive region for FDIs. In fact, he said, in other words, his message was, we need a rethink. We need to rethink on the current model of making ASEAN an attractive place for FDIs. From the private sector on AEC, this was the response from one of the private sector, frank one again. AEC 2015, not terribly relevant. Whether you hit the target in AEC 2015 is not important to us. We just want to see continuous progress and improvement in the integration of ASEAN. So the message is very simple from the private sector. Don't look for a different ASEAN in 2015, but look at the progress that we are continuously working towards in achieving that final goal, AEC 2015.
I think we came away with 6 points. The first point is that market access liberalization in ASEAN is incomplete. The media calls it open skies, but the reality is that it's not completely open. It's just partially open. The example being that a Malaysian carrier would be able to fly unlimited to all other points, all international points in ASEAN, but only from points in Malaysia. So they can fly unlimited from Kuala Lumpur to Manila, but not from Manila to Jakarta, except if the plane has to go back to Kuala Lumpur and came from Kuala Lumpur. So a stand-alone international flight between two other points is not allowed, and that was what we referred to as seventh freedom. And of course, domestic flights are also not allowed under the ASEAN plan for 2015. So it's not a true single aviation market as conceived in the European Union, for instance. So that's the first major difference. It's a modest liberalization. The second point is, even then with that modest agenda, whatever that's modest that's been put forward for liberalization is resisted. We talked about the fact that Indonesia and the Philippines, for instance, still have got reservations about opening up capital city airports for, say, a Kuala Lumpur, Jakarta unlimited operation by a Malaysian carrier. So even the modest proposal has difficulties because of the different levels of development and the different concerns that the different member states have about the pace of liberalization. The third point we made was that it's not only market access, it's ownership and control. Ownership and control rules have got to be liberalized as well, and that throws up similar, if not bigger, political problems because many countries have severe difficulties accepting that more than half of their airlines, more than half of the shareholding can actually be controlled by foreigners, even if the foreigners were fellow ASEAN member states. So there is this proposal now to have an ASEAN community carrier concept where an airline, say, set up in Indonesia can be 30% owned by Malaysians, 30% by Indonesians, 30% by Thais, and 10% by Japanese interests. So 90% is still in ASEAN hands, and you count the majority ownership by counting the whole family, and not just one country. But even this is slowly going through. It's in the two agreements, but there's still some way to go before this is going to be accepted. That's the third point. The fourth point that was thrown up by several members of the audience was that you can't blame some governments because there are infrastructure problems, airport capacity problems, and that these have got to be resolved. To what extent this really stops the pace of liberalization is left to be seen, but these are some of the concerns that have been raised by governments. And finally, the third point we made was that it's not only market access, it's ownership and control. Ownership and control rules have got to be liberalized as well, and that throws up similar, if not bigger, political problems because many countries have severe difficulties accepting that more than half of their airlines, more than half of the shareholding can actually be controlled by foreigners, even if the foreigners were fellow ASEAN member states. So there is this proposal now to have an ASEAN community carrier concept where an airline, say, set up in Indonesia can be 30% owned by Malaysians, 30% by Indonesians, 30% by Thais, and 10% by Japanese interests. So 90% is still in ASEAN hands, and you count the majority ownership by counting the whole family, and not just one country. But even this is slowly going through. It's in the two agreements, but there's still some way. An airline has set up an airline in Thailand. It was set up Air Asia Thailand. It's still 51% owned by Thai interests, but Air Asia, the parent group, owns 49%. And there's this whole big thing about who effectively controls Air Asia Thailand, but on paper, it's a Thai airline.
So that's a brilliant example that you've seen about how airlines and entrepreneurs get around rules, and the prediction made by Ram was that liberalization is here to stay, it's inevitable. If governments resist it, it's going to be futile. If I could put those words in his mouth, he's not here, I think that was how we concluded at the end of the day.
First point I think that's been said over and over is just private sector involvement. In our session, it was particularly mentioned in the area of standardizing, harmonizing data, and conducting business process analyses, which would involve some sort of public-private task force to get that started. Second point is physical infrastructure readiness. I think this was mentioned maybe just about every session today. Third is SMEs IT readiness. And so for their involvement in the ASEAN single window, they need to be supported in terms of IT readiness. And then the discussion went into different government agencies' IT readiness as well. So particularly at the border makes a difference. And related to that was legal framework readiness, point number 4. The example mentioned was Cambodia did not have any sort of e-commerce framework in place. But at the regional level, there also needs to be a regional framework, which the ASW Legal Working Group is working on. We talked about point number 5, regulatory streamlining and harmonization. Basically, it's nice to have these national single windows and even ASEAN single window, but if regulations are still burdensome, if it's still difficult for private sector to comply with, then even the best IT architecture is not going to be that helpful. Point number 6, which one of our panelists called for, is to use ASW for pre-arrival clearance. This was a key benefit and use of ASW. That's what helps the private sector integrate the global supply chain. And related to that point is just overall figure out how to add value from all the data that's being exchanged and collected, and help to reuse the data by the private sector to clear goods. And then last but not least, just to the uneven developments in NSWs of various countries. So once again, having this IT architecture, this regional architecture that connects to national single windows is nice. But if the national single windows are not effective, if they're not involved in the private sector in their developments, then ASW will not be as effective. And if I may add a point number 8 that I should have had here is just the ASEAN Trade Repository, which one of the panelists mentioned, and how it is essential to have national trade repositories at the national level where businesses can come in. If they say they want to import a particular product, they just have to type in the name. They get all the tariffs and regulations relevant to that particular product. And if that can then be integrated with the national single window.
The premise of this session that I was moderating on the investment, ASEAN investment area, the big question really was, are we doing everything necessary in our integration efforts? And how can we attract more FDI into the region? And in Dato' Noharuddin's presentation, he highlighted that, yes, ASEAN is still only getting a small share of total global FDI. But in his suggestions, he put forward several suggestions, and he, highlighted that there is this inherent need to create more excitement about AEC. And really that's all about creating awareness. And symposiums such as these kinds of initiatives really, I think, will go a long way in trying to address that kind of, in trying to answer that call. He called for the need to engage more with business stakeholders who are currently operating in the region, particularly to really understand what are the key challenges that they are facing doing business in ASEAN. And in our panel discussion, we really were fortunate to have the direct engagement and participation of well-established multinational companies currently operating in ASEAN. So we were really able to get their insights on those big questions. Generally, they all agreed that business prospects are good. Outlook for ASEAN seems quite positive. And at least 2 of them highlighted the significant returns from their initial investment years ago. and all recognized, I think, the tremendous potential and opportunities for further growth in ASEAN. Several challenges were highlighted, and this, I believe, is recurring across all the sessions. You highlighted it earlier, and the other moderators as well. But in our session, key challenges were the different standards and requirements that exist in all 10 ASEAN member states. So one company that has operations in multiple ASEAN member states would have to deal with different sets of standards, creating additional burdens for just this one company, even though, so that's one challenge. Poor transport infrastructure, also a recurring theme, extending to poor logistics, which translates to additional costs and loss of valuable time. The lack of transparency was also highlighted. Despite these challenges, though, it was interesting to note their assertion, and also this was made by other panelists in the previous session, that they will still carry on business as usual. And I really liked the analogy that they used in my session. Business is like water. It will find the path of least resistance. And I guess that really is the best way to explain why more FDI goes to certain countries and not to others. It will go to where it is easiest to do business. And, but they are coming from the perspective of MNCs, and what we need to bear in mind is that these challenges are even more detrimental to SMEs, small and medium enterprises, because they have less resources to be able to deal with these issues, and, and they really would adversely affect their development. And notably, the issues that they highlighted, the challenges that they highlighted are cross-sectoral in nature, and, it really is, there is really a need to prioritize them accordingly. Finally, again, the question of AEC 2015, no one seemed to be particularly concerned about the approaching deadline, but they did emphasize it is important for ASEAN to continue on its path towards improving the business environment and business climate in the region. Integration, harmonization, well, we are focusing on integration because if you consider IMF estimates for ASEAN in 2015, by then we're going to have a market of 645 million people with a GDP of about 2.7 trillion. So, it will continue to be on the political agenda.
But my sense that in the presentation of Mr. Lee highlights the benefits of integrated capital market in the region. He highlighted that size matters, that diversity of financial products matters, and that the mutual support matters. And at the same time, one of the panelists, Mr. Sarup of Standard Chartered, highlighted the importance of deep debt markets, which can contribute to the development of export-oriented SMEs. And of course, we do know SMEs are the critical anchor of a people-centered ASEAN. But his presentation is not so much of that, it's really financial stability. And he highlighted clearly that financial integration is not enough to have financial stability in the region. There is a need for complementary fiscal strength, financial strength, and external balance strength. All of that calls, of course, for stronger surveillance mechanisms within the region. Dr. Damoto's AMRO has that responsibility of, I guess, for ASEAN +3, but I guess also for ASEAN as such. And definitely the need for stronger coordination between the ASEAN Secretariat, AMRO, and actually also other research institutions in the region, because clearly a stable macroeconomy is a basic foundation for a good investment regime. Those are potential success stories as contribution of this group to an AEC 2015. But again, as was highlighted by Mr. Swarup, the importance of building deep debt markets, and that calls for a lot of regulatory reforms that were also discussed to some extent during the session. And finally, the SME ratings, we at least in my case, I feel that's very important for the region. And we do really welcome SMP initiatives on this. So overall, I come away with positive news on the financial integration and capital market front, but clearly it is not something that ends in 2015. This will be an ongoing, measured approach to liberalization, to integration of the financial sector and the capital markets.
I would actually like to congratulate all those who are still around. And as I said, I borrowed the words of Dr. Noha. The zombies have left but not because they do not want to be here. It's because they simply have many other things to do. And with that, I would like to request the assistance of those who are still remaining to thank the coordinators, the moderators for the session. Give them an applause, please. And with that, I pass the session back to the MC. Sarah?
Thank you very much, Mr. Subhash, for wrapping up the session so eloquently. Ladies, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to the end of the ASEAN Economic Community Symposium. We would like to thank you very much for attending and participating at today's event. Thank you very much, good evening, and thank you.
It's a pleasure.